they woke up to silence. The taps ran dry, sprinklers stood still, and the neighborhood's emergency water lines were gone all overnight. Panic spread as families realized their most basic needs were cut off, not by accident, but by the HOA. Bills left unpaid? Rules enforced with ruthless precision? Or something far more controlling? Neighbors scrambled, children cried, and pets suffered. No one knew how long it would last, and no one knew who would step in. Could one small oversight spiral into a full-blown community disaster? What would happen if no one acted in time? In the quiet suburb of Willow Creek, mornings were usually calm. Birds chirped over neatly trimmed lawns, children rode bikes along the sidewalks, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves. Among them was Mark Turner, a single father with 2 young children, who cherished the small joys of his tidy home: weekend barbecues, impromptu soccer games in the yard, and evenings spent laughing over dinner. Life wasn't perfect, bills piled up, the car needed constant repairs, and the HOA's rules sometimes felt strict, but Mark loved the sense of community. Across the street lived Helen Granger, the HOA president, known for her immaculate property and strict enforcement of neighborhood regulations. She took pride in keeping order, and even small infractions, like a slightly crooked mailbox or a minor paint discrepancy, earned her scrutiny. Residents often whispered about her meticulousness. Some admired it, others quietly resented it, but no one expected how far her rule enforcement would escalate. For Mark, life seemed predictable and manageable, until one fateful notice arrived in his mailbox. It hinted at overdue fees, but more importantly, it carried a warning: failure to comply could affect more than just his wallet. The tension was subtle at first, a lingering unease, a quiet question mark hovering over the neighborhood's routine. Little did Mark know, the balance between normalcy and chaos was about to shatter, and the very water flowing through their homes would become the flashpoint for a conflict that would engulf the entire community. The first few days after the water shutdown were chaos wrapped in disbelief. Mark Turner woke each morning to the same horrifying reality: faucets yielding nothing, sprinklers dormant, and the central emergency water line, the lifeline for the entire neighborhood, completely offline. Families were scrambling. Bottles of water vanished within hours, neighbors hoarded supplies, and children stared at empty sinks, confused and anxious. For Mark, the frustration grew every time he realized that the HOA's decision wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Helen Granger, the HOA president, seemed untouchable. From her pristine office, she sent out notices with a precise, almost surgical cruelty: unpaid fees must be settled immediately, or residents would face escalating penalties. But the penalties went far beyond money. Sprinklers stayed off, fountains remained dry, and even the neighborhood park's small fire suppression system was disabled. Every attempt to challenge her authority met with a meticulously worded response, citing obscure clauses hidden deep within HOA bylaws. Mark realized quickly that he wasn't just fighting for water, he was fighting an entire system designed to enforce control through fear. It didn't take long for tension to ripple through Willow Creek. Neighbors who had once shared casual greetings in the morning now exchanged worried whispers at their fences. Families began rationing water, sharing what little they had with friends and neighbors who were most vulnerable. Elderly residents complained that they couldn't fill their buckets to shower, and parents panicked over school lunches and cleaning after their children. The community that had once seemed orderly and predictable now felt suffocating, teetering on the edge of chaos. Mark tried to reason with Helen directly. He visited the HOA office, documents in hand, heart pounding with urgency. "This isn't about money anymore," he pleaded silently in his mind, knowing words alone couldn't convey the fear spreading through homes. "This is about safety, and the children, and the pets." But Helen's response was cold, calculated, and infuriating. She reminded him, with an icy smile, that rules were rules, and non-compliance would have consequences. Escalation followed swiftly. Notices arrived in mailboxes detailing fines for even the smallest infractions. A mailbox that leaned slightly? $100. A swing set installed without prior approval? $250. Grass not trimmed to the HOA's precise standard? Another fine. Every minor act of normal life became an opportunity for Helen to exert power, her influence stretching from financial penalties to subtle psychological manipulation. Residents felt trapped, unsure if protesting would make matters worse. Social media became the lifeline. Mark posted videos of empty sinks and dry sprinklers, capturing the incredulity and fear of the neighborhood. Comments poured in, neighbors vented frustrations, shared survival strategies, and debated whether Helen had crossed legal boundaries. The tension grew, but so did the determination. The community realized that if they wanted change, they had to act collectively. In the days that followed, a small coalition formed. Mark organized secret meetings at the park, careful to avoid drawing immediate attention from the HOA. Families swapped resources and shared information about legal loopholes. Hope began to flicker, but it was tempered with fear. Helen was always watching. One late night, Mark received an ominous note slipped under his door: "Pay up, or suffer the consequences." Panic surged, but so did resolve. The community had reached a tipping point. The stakes became painfully clear when a minor medical emergency revealed the most frightening truth: without access to water, even the smallest incidents could spiral into disasters. A neighbor's elderly father needed urgent care, and the disabled water lines delayed basic first aid. Anger and fear collided in the neighborhood, turning private frustrations into public outrage. Mark knew it was only a matter of time before this conflict erupted in full view, and he braced himself for the inevitable confrontation that would either topple Helen's control or leave the community devastated. Each day that passed added new layers of pressure. Families fought to preserve their dignity and safety, neighbors who had once been indifferent joined the coalition, and the whispers grew louder. Every meeting, every post, every act of defiance was a countdown to the moment when the community could no longer ignore the injustice. And as the sun set each evening over Willow Creek, one thought haunted Mark: how long could one person's obsession with control hold an entire neighborhood hostage before someone finally pushed back, and what would that push cost them? The tension that had been simmering for days, weeks, and months reached a boiling point one sweltering afternoon in Willow Creek. Mark Turner, representing a coalition of desperate neighbors, arrived at the HOA's annual meeting with cameras rolling, journalists in tow, and stacks of evidence in his hands. The room, usually reserved for polite nods and paperwork, felt electric, charged with fear, anger, and anticipation. Every eye in the room was fixed on Helen Granger, the unyielding HOA president, who had ruled over the neighborhood with meticulous cruelty and cold efficiency. Mark stepped forward, his voice steady but firm in the charged atmosphere. He presented the documentation of disabled water lines, punitive fines for trivial violations, and dozens of personal accounts from neighbors struggling to survive the shutdown. Every word cut through the room like a scalpel, exposing the absurdity, pettiness, and cruelty of Helen's decisions. Residents who had quietly suffered now nodded in disbelief, their silent outrage transformed into visible tension. Helen attempted to defend herself, citing obscure clauses buried deep in the HOA bylaws. Her calm, rehearsed statements were meant to assert authority, but the evidence stacked against her was undeniable. Mark's coalition highlighted one glaring oversight: Helen had failed to comply with state HOA regulations in her notices, making her actions legally questionable. Gasps echoed through the room as residents realized the magnitude of her overreach. What had begun as petty rule enforcement had escalated into potential legal liability and public embarrassment. The climax came when the local fire department revealed a chilling truth: had a fire broken out in the neighborhood during the water shutdown, the disabled hydrants could have caused catastrophic damage. Families were at risk, and the realization ignited a collective fury. Helen, who had once projected an image of control and authority, now faced the full weight of the community's scrutiny, the media's lens, and the looming possibility of legal consequences. Mark, standing firm, delivered the turning point that the neighborhood had been waiting for, a declaration that they would no longer tolerate fear-driven governance. The room erupted in applause, cries, and even tears. Helen's carefully constructed image crumbled, and for the first time, she appeared uncertain, vulnerable, and human. As the meeting drew to a tense close, one thought lingered in every mind: the battle was far from over, but the tide had irrevocably shifted. The community had reclaimed a measure of power, and the next chapter, the resolution, promised both justice and long overdue accountability. In the days following the explosive HOA meeting, Willow Creek began to breathe again. The tension that had gripped every home, every street corner, and every neighbor finally started to ease. The emergency water lines were restored within hours, not through compromise or negotiation, but because the public exposure and legal pressure had left Helen Granger with no other choice. Residents opened their faucets to flowing water, splashing their faces and filling buckets in a kind of collective relief that bordered on celebration. It was more than water returning to their homes, it was a restoration of normalcy, dignity, and control over their lives. For Mark Turner, the victory was deeply personal. He watched as families who had struggled silently for weeks finally began to smile again, as children played in the yard without fear, and as elderly neighbors filled their glasses without hesitation. Yet the relief was tempered with reflection. The crisis had shown just how fragile the balance of power was in a seemingly calm neighborhood. One person's obsession with control, backed by ambiguous bylaws and unchecked authority, had the potential to disrupt lives and sow chaos. That realization left Mark with a lingering sense of vigilance. In the aftermath, the HOA board underwent a complete restructuring. Helen Granger, once the figure of unyielding authority, was voted out amid the fallout. Her departure wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a clear message that the residents would no longer tolerate unilateral decisions that jeopardized safety and trust. The new board introduced reforms that prioritized transparency, accountability, and the community's well-being over rigid rule enforcement. Neighborhood meetings now involved open discussions, clear communication, and democratic decision-making. Residents felt empowered in ways they hadn't before, and a sense of ownership replaced fear. The legal ramifications of Helen's actions also sent shockwaves beyond Willow Creek. Lawyers who had followed the case noted the unusual severity of shutting off emergency water access as a punitive measure. The story reached other neighborhoods and HOA boards, sparking debates about the limits of authority, the importance of regulatory compliance, and the ethical responsibilities of those in positions of power. Willow Creek had inadvertently become a cautionary tale, a vivid example of what could happen when rules are enforced without humanity or foresight. For Mark and his family, life gradually returned to a semblance of normal. Weekend barbecues resumed, laughter filled the backyards, and the children once again rode bikes along the sidewalks with carefree abandon. But the community's shared trauma had left a mark. Residents remained attentive, ensuring that new rules were reasonable and that board decisions were scrutinized carefully. They had learned that vigilance wasn't paranoia, it was survival. The neighborhood had bonded in ways that went beyond friendly waves. A shared ordeal had forged resilience, trust, and mutual accountability. Interestingly, the absurdity and pettiness that had defined Helen's rule remained a topic of conversation and even humor. Neighbors would occasionally joke about fines for crooked mailboxes or miscolored flowers, a small way of reclaiming power through laughter. It was a subtle reminder of the surreal situation they had endured, and it allowed the community to process the emotional toll without bitterness consuming them. The shared experience became a story passed down informally, a lesson in both vigilance and solidarity. Beyond the immediate neighborhood, the incident prompted changes in HOA policies across the county. State regulators issued clarifications on what constituted legal enforcement versus overreach, and some boards even instituted emergency preparedness guidelines to prevent a repeat of such crises. Willow Creek residents felt a quiet pride in knowing their struggle had contributed to tangible improvements in governance and safety, not just for their own community but for countless others who might have otherwise faced similar abuses. Mark often reflected on the broader meaning of the ordeal. It wasn't just about unpaid fees or petty rules, it was about the human cost of unchecked authority, the fragility of trust, and the power of collective action. Ordinary people, when united, could challenge even the most rigid and oppressive systems. He realized that courage wasn't always loud or confrontational, sometimes it was persistence, documentation, and the quiet determination to protect one's family and neighbors. The final takeaway settled like a quiet truth over Willow Creek: communities thrive not through fear or blind obedience, but through transparency, empathy, and mutual respect. The residents had been tested, and they had emerged stronger, more connected, and more aware of their shared responsibility. It was a story that reminded everyone watching, whether in Willow Creek or beyond, that systems are only as fair as the people who uphold them, and that standing up against injustice, even at a personal cost, could reshape lives and communities in profound ways. As the sun set over the neighborhood once more, Mark stood on his porch, watching children play in the sprinklers, laughter echoing through streets that had once been filled with fear. The crisis had passed, but the lessons endured. He thought quietly, as many of his neighbors did, how many other communities remain silent in the face of unfair power? And what would it take for them to reclaim their voice, their safety, and their dignity? The story of Willow Creek was over, but the questions it raised would linger, a call to vigilance, courage, and the enduring power of a united community. Mark Turner stood, thoughtful, observing his children play in the sprinklers, feeling a deep sense of responsibility and hope for the future. The ordeal had bonded the neighborhood, and although the crisis was over, the vigilance and lessons learned would remain, shaping Willow Creek into a more resilient, aware, and united community.